In the meantime, we're going to move on to overseas tensions right now, and this could be a very, very big story for the election year ahead. Tensions dramatically escalating in the Middle East as Saudi Arabia cuts all commercial ties with Iran, ends air travel between the two countries, and bars its citizens from traveling there. Over the weekend, demonstrators took to the streets of Tehran, attacking the Saudi embassy. The violence in response to the beheading of a Shia cleric who was one of 47 prisoners executed in Saudi Arabia on Saturday. Well, after the attack on its embassy in Tehran, the Saudis cut all diplomatic ties with Iran, ordering Iranian diplomats to leave the country within 48 hours. Then, Saudi allies, United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, also scaled back relations with Iran in a Sunni-Shia standoff that could impact everything from the price of oil to the battle to defeat ISIS and maybe even some bigger topics as well. Jonathan Schanzer is the Vice President of Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and former terrorism analyst for the State Department. Some of your research focuses on Saudi Arabia, Jonathan, so it's nice to have you on the program. You say you expect this headline to be one of the biggest stories of the year. Why?
Well, hi, Jenna. First of all, this has been a conflict that's been in the making really since the 7th century, so it's not new. But over the last year or so, we have really seen inflamed tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, between Sunni and Shia across the region. Of course, it was at the root of a lot of the conflict that we saw in Iraq during our time there, where we were fighting insurgents. But also now it is the root of the problem in Yemen. It's the root of the problem in Syria. And so now we have this very outward manifestation of a conflict that I expect to grow over the course of the next year.
In simplest of terms, can you take us back to the 7th century, Jonathan, and can you give us a Cliff Notes version of the big difference between Sunni and Shia?
Sure. I mean, a lot of it was about succession, basically, who had the right to rule. Shia are typically more interpretive of the Quran, but have a sense that that the direct descendants of Muhammad should continue to rule over all of Islam. Sunnis have a more, let's say, literal or orthodox interpretation of the Quran, but are maybe a little bit more permissive in terms of who should be caliph. That's kind of the footnotes version of it, but it has really turned into a Machiavellian fight over control of the Middle East, exacerbated in large part by the Iranian nuclear deal, which has empowered Iran to a great extent and given it a lot of money and perhaps a lot of weapons to work with in the years to come.
I'm curious your thoughts on that, because that is coming up as we're covering this story. There's the reference to the nuclear deal with Iran. We, of course, have diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. We're working on those relations with Iran, and this nuclear deal is part of it. So what is the impact for the United States watching these two sides and the tensions ramp up?
Well, I think it's really going to put a lot of pressure on the U.S. right now. We've been trying to so-called rebalance our foreign policy portfolio. A lot of this was about empowering Iran, making it a more responsible actor in the region. The Saudis want nothing to do with this plan, and I think that what we're seeing right now is the Saudis openly challenging our foreign policy. There's action potentially that's going to be taken at the Arab League right now, where a lot of the other Arab countries are going to hop on board, try to isolate Iran, and that's going to make it a lot harder, I think, to achieve any kind of reconciliation in Syria. Not that it was going to be easy in the first place, but it should make it a lot harder. And, of course, the ongoing strife in Yemen and beyond.
So you're talking about all these different ripple effects that could be part of this big story. I'm curious about the timing in all of this. Over the holidays, the Iranians fired missiles at one of our warships. There was talk of sanctions by the United States, and then now we're in a waiting period. Those sanctions aren't taking place. What do you make of the timing by the Saudis? Why did they decide to do this now?
Well, I think that they realized that the United States was not going to do anything about Iran's ballistic missile program. In fact, we had sanctions that were teed up, and then ultimately the administration backed down to the consternation of those in Congress and others who wanted to see the U.S. take action. I think the Saudis were among the more frustrated, thinking that really we've paved the road to a stronger hegemonic Iran, an Iran that will be able to develop those ballistic missiles, an Iran that will have a nuclear program in 10 or 12 years, an Iran where the arms embargo is going to be lifted in 5 years, and of course you've got roughly $100 billion flowing into the coffers of Iran. And so the Saudis basically said 2015 was a rough year. We've had enough. We're not going to let the Iranians trample all over us and across the region. And so it looks as if they're putting their foot down and issuing a direct challenge to the Iranians.
Interesting. So we'll watch, because the fear of Iran getting a nuclear weapon is very real to those in the Middle East, especially the Saudis, who to our knowledge, do not have a nuclear weapon. Jonathan, great to have you as always. Thank you.
Pleasure.